Have you ever seen a dog stop a funeral to save a life? When a loyal German shepherd named Ranger leaped onto his master's coffin and began to bark, everyone thought it was grief. But what followed shocked doctors, exposed corruption, and revealed a miracle no one expected. Was it instinct or something divine guiding this brave animal? What happened next will restore your faith in God's mysterious ways. Keep watching, because some resurrections come wrapped in fur and loyalty. If this story touches your heart, please share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment if you've ever felt a silent prayer answered in an unexpected way. And if you believe that God watches over the broken and the brave, leave an amen below to join in the faith. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the quiet power of love, faithfulness, and the mysterious ways God works. May He bless you. Asheville, North Carolina, sat under a blanket of early spring mist, the sky a soft wash of gray, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and budding dogwoods. A gentle rain had fallen overnight, leaving the streets glistening and the grass underfoot damp but vibrant. At the edge of the city stood Hawthorne Funeral Home, a stately brick building with white columns and a proud American flag flying at half-mast. This morning, a long procession of uniformed officers moved silently across the lawn, their badges glinting beneath cloud-diffused light. The occasion was solemn, the funeral of Police Chief Thomas Bennett, a man whose absence now loomed larger than his life had ever dared to. Inside the chapel, the air was cool and reverent. Soft organ music floated beneath the vaulted ceiling as family, friends, and colleagues filled the wooden pews. At the front of the room sat a gleaming mahogany casket, draped in the flag of the Asheville Police Department, flanked by white lilies and framed photographs of the late chief smiling beside officers, children, and citizens he had served. Bennett had died 3 days prior, reportedly of sudden cardiac arrest in his home. His passing shocked the city. At 62, he was still a commanding figure. 6'2", broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his gaze both stern and kind, known for his unshakable integrity and deep sense of justice. For over 30 years he had served Asheville, the last 15 as chief. He and his wife Laura had no children, but he was considered a father to many in the department. Near the third row sat Daniel Morgan, a detective in his late 30s, tall and lean with the calm, deliberate movements of someone who had learned long ago to hide his turbulence behind control. His hair was dark brown, just beginning to gray at the temples, his skin tanned from years of stakeouts and street work. There was something quiet about Daniel, something weighed down in his eyes that never quite left. Few in the room knew that as a teenager, Daniel had been arrested for robbery. He was 16 and spiraling when Bennett had first found him, bruised, angry, and hopeless. Instead of throwing him to the system, Bennett took him to dinner, brought him to the station every Saturday to mop floors and write reports by hand, and eventually vouched for him at the police academy. Daniel owed him more than a career. He owed him everything. At Daniel's feet sat Ranger, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat streaked with gray and amber eyes that scanned the room with uncanny intelligence. He was larger than most, with a thick chest, scarred hind leg, and a notched ear from an explosion during a failed drug bust 5 years ago. Ranger had been a K-9 officer trained for narcotics and suspect apprehension. After losing partial hearing in one ear, he was retired, and Bennett took him home without hesitation. Since then, Ranger had become a quiet shadow at the chief's side. Loyal, disciplined, deeply bonded. At the altar, Reverend James Holt, a local pastor in his 60s with a round face and thin voice, recited scripture and offered comfort. Laura Bennett, the chief's widow, sat alone in the front pew. Laura was 58, tall and willowy with a gentle demeanor and composed bearing. Her hazel eyes, often warm, were now rimmed with red. Her auburn hair was streaked with silver, pinned neatly beneath a black veil. She had been a public school teacher for over 30 years and was loved for her patience and quiet wisdom. 3 miscarriages early in their marriage had left her no biological children, but her compassion had extended to hundreds of students, and to Ranger, who often waited outside her classroom like a guardian. She held a folded handkerchief in her hands, unmoving, lost in the still ache of grief. Near the side aisle stood Deputy Chief Scott Whitaker. At 49, he was trim, blond, and sharp-featured, with a tailored uniform and a politician's smile. Whitaker had served under Bennett for 8 years and was next in line for the chief's office. To most, he was capable, articulate, and ambitious. But for those who worked closely with him, there was an edge, a chill that clung to his words, a constant calculation behind his eyes. He was watching everything. The silence was deep until Ranger shifted. At first, it was subtle, a twitch of his ears, a slow rise to his feet. Daniel looked down, confused. Ranger's body stiffened. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Laura turned just as the dog lunged forward, leash slipping from her hands. His bark exploded through the chapel like a gunshot. Ranger bounded up the aisle, claws scraping across the floor, barking with growing urgency. Officers turned. Mourners gasped. One woman shrieked. The minister fell silent. Ranger reached the casket, rearing up, paws landing with a heavy thud on the polished wood. He howled. Then he began clawing at the silk drape covering the lower half. "Get that dog out of here!" Whitaker shouted, stepping forward, his face red. "This is a funeral, not a circus." 2 officers moved to restrain Ranger, but he snarled, baring his teeth, eyes locked on the casket as if it concealed something monstrous. "Wait," Daniel said, rising to his feet. All eyes turned to him. He stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "Don't touch him." Whitaker scowled. "He's disrupting the service." "He's alerting," Daniel replied. "Not panicking. Not grieving. Alerting. There's a difference." Laura stood slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's never acted like this. Not once." Daniel knelt beside Ranger, placing a steady hand on the dog's trembling back. Ranger's body was rigid, his hackles raised. He whined again, this time softer, but with the ache of something trying to speak without words. Daniel looked at the casket, then at Laura, then at Whitaker, whose fists were clenched too tightly. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "Ranger thinks Thomas is still in there." A stunned silence swept the chapel. And the bark returned, piercing, desperate, one last cry for anyone to listen. The sky over Asheville had turned from gray to steel. Low clouds hung heavy above the Blue Ridge foothills, and the wind moved through the trees with a quiet, restless rhythm, like whispers from the dead. At the Bennett residence, tucked behind a hedge-lined road on the western edge of town, the air was too still for comfort. Daniel Morgan stood in the driveway, his shoes sinking slightly into rain-softened gravel. Beside him, Ranger sat with tense posture, ears forward, gaze fixed on the front door. The house itself was modest by official standards, a single-story colonial with stone trim and a wraparound porch. The American flag above the steps fluttered only slightly, too weakly to speak. Daniel had not been here since 2 weeks before the chief's death, when he had dropped off some case files late in the evening and shared a quiet glass of bourbon with the man who had once saved his life. That night, Bennett had looked tired, distracted. Now, the silence of the house felt unnatural. Laura Bennett opened the door before Daniel knocked. She wore a navy cardigan over a black blouse, her hair pulled back into a low knot. Her eyes were still swollen from the funeral, but the red had faded to a deep, tired gray. "I thought you might come," she said softly, stepping aside. Inside, the house felt paused, half alive. A jacket still hung on the peg by the door. A coffee mug sat in the sink. Daniel stepped in with Ranger close behind, the dog's claws ticking softly against the hardwood floor. Ranger made a low sound in his throat, not quite a growl. "I need to ask you something, Laura," Daniel said, keeping his voice measured. "Was there ever an autopsy?" She blinked, then shook her head slowly. "No. They told me it wasn't necessary. The paramedics said it was a textbook cardiac arrest. They were so sure. Scott said it would only cause more distress." Her voice broke on the last word. Daniel's jaw tightened. "They didn't even confirm with the coroner?" "They didn't want to put me through that," she said, with a bitterness he hadn't heard before. Said he deserved a dignified rest. Daniel looked around the living room. The fireplace was unlit. Bennett's reading glasses still rested on the arm of his chair. Ranger moved with purpose, sniffing along the rug, past the fireplace, down the hallway, stopping at a closed door. That was his office, Laura said quietly. Daniel approached, resting a hand on the doorknob, hesitating. Would it be all right if I? She nodded. Just be careful. He didn't like people going through his things. The room beyond was dim, the blinds pulled halfway. The desk was neat, too neat. Only a notepad and pen rested beside a powered-off computer monitor. Daniel checked the drawers, top two filled with invoices, city paperwork, and folders. The third drawer stuck slightly. Inside was a sealed manila envelope labeled only with a single word: doubt. Daniel slipped it into his coat. Ranger began pacing along the far side of the room. Then he stopped at a small framed photo on the bookshelf, an old team picture from the APD Narcotics Division. Daniel picked it up and turned it over. Nothing on the back, but when he looked closer, he noticed a sticky note wedged behind the frame. It was folded, the ink smudged from age. For words, hastily scribbled in Bennett's familiar hand. Osprey, don't trust anyone. Daniel stared at the word. It meant nothing to him, yet. Behind him, Laura cleared her throat. There's something else, she said, her voice barely audible. He turned. The last few weeks, Thomas had been coming home late. He'd never explain. He told me not to worry, but I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid. Daniel stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Afraid of what? She looked down, her hands clenched around a tissue. He wouldn't say. I think he was trying to protect me. Before Daniel could answer, Ranger suddenly growled. It was low, warning, primal. The dog stood rigid, staring out the living room window. A white sedan had just pulled up across the street, too slowly. Its engine idled. Daniel stepped toward the window. He couldn't see the driver's face behind the glare of the windshield. After 30 seconds, the sedan pulled away, disappearing down the curve of the road. You recognize that car? Daniel asked. Laura shook her head. No, but it's been here before. Twice yesterday. Once the day before the funeral. Daniel reached into his pocket and handed her a small slip of paper. If anything happens, if anyone strange comes near, call me or Detective Sarah Kincaid. Don't talk to Whitaker. Don't talk to anyone unless you're sure. Laura nodded, then looked at Ranger. He hasn't eaten since Thomas died, she whispered. But he sleeps in front of that door. Every night. Daniel looked at the dog, who still stood sentinel, eyes fixed on the window. He knows something's not finished. That night, Daniel returned to his office at the department. The main floor was quiet. Many officers were still off duty for the chief's passing. Daniel bypassed the front desk and entered the small, unlit records room, where old case files were still kept on paper for backup. Sarah Kincaid was already there, flipping through a box. Sarah was in her early 30s, short and strong, with curly dark hair pulled into a bun and a sharp, precise way of speaking. She had transferred from Chapel Hill 2 years ago and built a quiet reputation for thoroughness. Daniel trusted her, one of the few people left in the building he could say that about. Find anything? He asked. Sarah handed him a folder. No autopsy filed, just a standard death certificate. Signed by EMS, not the coroner. That's against protocol, Daniel. Especially for someone like Bennett. He flipped through the pages. Everything felt rushed. Too rushed. Laura said Whitaker handled the arrangements. Told her not to push for an autopsy. Sarah crossed her arms. Sounds like he wanted this closed before questions started. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind turning over the pieces. There's more. Bennett left a note. Just a name, Osprey. Means anything to you? Sarah frowned. Maybe. Could be a code name. Or someone high up in one of our old investigations. I'll dig. Daniel glanced down at his phone. A message blinked on screen. No ID. Just 4 words. He wasn't supposed bark. He felt the chill crawl up his spine. Then he deleted the message. Night in Asheville had a way of settling like a quiet verdict. The rain had stopped but left the city damp, glistening under pale sodium lights that hummed with age. At the back of Hawthorne Funeral Home, away from the main chapel, The side viewing room had been dimmed for the night. Most of the mourners had gone. Only the smell of lilies and cedar polish lingered in the air, thick and cloying. Daniel Morgan sat alone on a straight-backed chair, elbows on knees, facing the closed casket of Chief Thomas Bennett. Ranger lay at his feet, eyes open, head on his paws, unmoving but alert. Daniel had insisted on staying. He hadn't trusted the way things were unfolding, the absence of an autopsy, the rushed burial, the anonymous message warning him that Ranger wasn't supposed to bark. Something was wrong, and his gut told him the answers weren't buried. Not yet. The funeral staff had hesitated, but ultimately allowed him access for the night. They didn't argue long after he flashed his badge and said he'd file the overnight report himself. It was just past 11:30 p.m. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the windows creak faintly in their panes. Daniel's jacket was draped over the back of a pew, and his holster sat beside him on the floor, close but not obvious. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he wasn't sleeping either. The silence was unnerving. Ranger hadn't moved in nearly half an hour, but Daniel could feel the dog's attention like a presence. From time to time, the shepherd's ears twitched, tracking sounds Daniel couldn't hear. Then, without warning, Ranger rose to his feet. The dog's body went stiff. His head turned toward the entry hallway, ears perked, eyes narrowed. A moment later, the side door creaked open. Daniel stood, calm but ready. A tall man entered, dressed in a dark overcoat with the collar turned up. His gait was smooth, deliberate, like someone accustomed to moving unnoticed. He was perhaps in his late 50s, with short-cropped gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His skin was pale, face lined but not worn, and he carried himself with military precision. "I apologize," the man said softly, his voice educated, lightly touched by a northern accent. "Didn't mean to startle you. I came to pay my respects. I knew Thomas years ago. Nathaniel Cross." Daniel didn't relax. "Friends from where?" "Military originally," Cross said without hesitation. "I was stationed at Fort Bragg. Met Thomas during a multi-jurisdictional task force on trafficking in the late 90s. We kept in touch over the years. Never close, but respected each other." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He hadn't heard Bennett speak of a cross, and he knew the chief's stories better than most. "This isn't public viewing anymore. Security protocols require clearance after hours." "I understand." "The woman at reception, older, gray curls, thin glasses? She let me in through the side. I didn't realize it was closed." Cross gave a practiced smile. Ranger's low growl cut through the room like a blade. He stepped between Daniel and the stranger, body low, tail stiff. "I see the dog remembers me," Cross said, stepping back slightly. "Not fondly, it seems." Daniel kept his tone even. "Ranger doesn't growl without reason." Cross held up both hands. "I mean no harm. I'll go if I'm unwelcome." Ranger barked, sharp and sudden, then lunged toward the casket, not the man. He circled it, pacing, then stopped, head pressed low, staring at the wood. Daniel moved quickly. "Stay where you are," he said to Cross. Then he heard it, a sound he couldn't explain. Faint. A soft bump. Like the shift of fabric. Or breath. He approached the casket slowly, heart pounding, eyes never leaving the polished surface. Ranger pawed at the base, barking again, then whining. Daniel leaned in, listening. Nothing. Cross moved quietly behind him. "You heard it, didn't you?" Daniel turned. "You need to leave. Now." Cross nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll be in town until Monday, staying at the Winslow Inn. If you find anything troubling, I'd be willing to talk." He left the same way he came, in silence, without looking back. Daniel locked the side door behind him and returned to the casket. He stared at it for a long time, listening. Nothing more came. No movement. No sound. Just the smell of lilies and the creak of the old building. Ranger refused to leave the casket's side. An hour later, Daniel began pacing to keep his mind sharp. He ended up back in Bennett's private prep room, a small side study the funeral director had set aside for family access. There he found a desk. Out of habit, he checked the drawers. Most were empty. But in the bottom one, beneath a legal pad, was a leather-bound notebook. Bennett's handwriting. The pages were dense with scribbled names, half-erased notes, symbols. One page had a single phrase circled several times. Osprey equals DH. A connection. But to who? There were timelines, names he recognized from older cases, some crossed out. A few local politicians. A retired judge. A city contract officer. All scratched or boxed. And that same name again, Osprey. Ranger padded into the room. He moved toward the desk, sniffed at the open drawer, then whined and scratched gently at the wood beneath. Daniel looked closer. Beneath the drawer's base, a false bottom. Inside, a small flash drive taped to the wood. He pocketed it. Dawn was still hours away. Morning broke with an uneasy quiet over Asheville. The city, still wrapped in early spring chill, had barely shaken off the haze of the previous night. A low mist hung over the cemetery grounds where the second, final service for Chief Thomas Bennett was to be held. Rows of uniformed officers gathered under the bare branches of oak trees, their expressions somber, their breaths faint wisps in the morning air. The flag-draped coffin rested at the front, guarded not just by honor, but by suspicion. Daniel Morgan stood near the front, his face stony, his dark overcoat buttoned to the collar. Ranger sat at his side, more alert than ever. The German shepherd, large and lean with a fading black saddle on golden fur, had not left the casket's side since dawn. He hadn't barked yet, but his entire body seemed coiled like a spring. The service began with protocol, bagpipes, a slow reading of Bennett's record, and speeches from fellow officers. Then came the moment for the final farewell. Officers stepped forward in pairs to salute the casket. But just as Deputy Chief Harold Whitaker approached with 2 city council members, Ranger snapped. The dog lunged forward, barking wildly. His teeth caught the edge of the burial shroud, ripping it. People gasped. 2 honor guards tried to restrain him, but Ranger spun loose, placing his body firmly between the casket and everyone else, barking toward the wood like he was warning it to stay shut, or pleading for someone inside to be heard. Daniel reacted instantly. Nobody move. Whitaker, tall, red-faced, with salt and pepper hair slicked back and a gut he carried like a badge of authority, stormed forward. This is disgraceful. Get that mutt out of here. Daniel stepped between him and Ranger. No one touches him. He's ruining the funeral, Whitaker spat. Thomas deserved better than this. If you respected Thomas, Daniel said quietly but firmly, you'd open the casket. A stunned silence fell. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whitaker looked like he was about to erupt. Absolutely not. I have reason to believe Chief Bennett is not dead, Daniel announced. Gasps again. Whitaker stepped closer, his voice low and furious. Are you insane? You want to desecrate the body based on a dog's reaction. Daniel didn't blink. This dog has served in 23 high-risk operations. He saved lives. He saved mine. And he knows something is wrong. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Let them check." The tension hung for one long beat. Then, unexpectedly, Laura Bennett, dressed in black, stepped forward from the front row. Her voice wavered but held. Thomas wouldn't want doubt. Let them open it. Under pressure, Whitaker relented with a grudging nod. 2 pallbearers unlatched the top. Slowly, the casket lid creaked open. Inside lay Thomas Bennett, his face pale but not ashen, his chest sunken but there. Ranger whined and stepped forward. Daniel leaned in. Then it happened. The faintest flicker of movement. A twitch of the eyelid. Get medical now. Daniel shouted. Chaos erupted. A young officer ran to the radio van. Ranger placed his paws on the edge of the casket, eyes wide, whining softly. Within minutes, EMTs had arrived. The woman leading the team, Dr. Hannah Ellsworth, couldn't have been more than 28, with dark freckles, sharp gray eyes, and a slim build. She moved with crisp, professional urgency. Her gloved hands went straight to the carotid. He has a pulse, she whispered. Whitaker turned pale. That can't be. Hannah cut away part of Bennett's shirt collar. Pupils reactive. Breathing is shallow. She leaned in, inspecting the neck. Then the arm. Her expression darkened. He has 2 puncture wounds. One behind the ear, one inner forearm. Blood pooling near both. This looks like induced catalepsy. Daniel's heart pounded. You're saying he was poisoned? Not poisoned to die, she replied. Poisoned to seem dead. A barbiturate cocktail. Hard to detect unless you're looking for it. Someone wanted him out of the picture, not gone forever. Not yet. Whitaker backed away, muttering something under his breath. Ranger jumped onto the foot of the casket and lay down there, resting his head on Bennett's boots like a sentry returned to his post. The crowd was too stunned to speak. As the ambulance pulled away, Daniel looked toward the horizon, clouds beginning to part. They had pulled a man back from death, but someone had tried very hard to bury him before he could speak. The sirens faded into the mist as the ambulance carrying Chief Bennett sped toward Mission Hospital, its lights blinking urgently through the chilly Asheville morning. Rain clouds were beginning to gather again, casting a pale, blue-gray sheen across the cemetery lawn, where stunned officers lingered in silence. Daniel Morgan watched it all unfold with clenched fists. He had no doubt now, someone had wanted Thomas Bennett dead, or at least silent. And worse, they'd almost succeeded. As people began to disperse from the disrupted funeral, Daniel scanned the crowd for Deputy Chief Harold Whitaker. But the man who had loudly objected to opening the casket had vanished the moment the truth emerged. No goodbye, no explanation, no sign. That alone sent a chill through Daniel far colder than the spring wind creeping into his coat. He turned back toward the casket. The funeral workers had not yet begun to dismantle the setup. Ranger sat faithfully near the coffin's base, eyes focused on something, or someone, that wasn't there anymore. Daniel moved around to the far side of the casket to help the workers fold the flag. That's when his hand brushed against a stiff corner in the inside lining of Bennett's dress uniform jacket. It was subtle, almost like a misplaced seam. Daniel paused. Carefully, he pulled back the fabric. Sewn beneath the interior layer, nearly invisible, was a small black flash drive, barely the length of a pinky finger. He didn't hesitate. He slipped it into his coat pocket just as the workers closed the casket for the last time. Later that afternoon, back at the station, Daniel shut himself inside Bennett's old office. The door creaked slightly when it shut, the room still heavy with his late mentor's presence. Dust motes danced in slanted sunlight from the blinds. Ranger padded silently behind, sniffed the carpet, then moved straight to the heavy mahogany desk and sat squarely in front of it. Daniel booted up the old laptop still on Bennett's desk. To his surprise, it wasn't password locked. He plugged in the flash drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared, labeled Arcadia Logs. Inside were dozens of video files and documents. At the top of the list was a document titled Whitaker_confession.mp4. Daniel clicked play. The footage was grainy and dimly lit, clearly from a hidden camera. It showed Whitaker, leaning back in a bar booth, speaking with someone whose face was out of frame. His voice was distinct, low and full of disdain. If Bennett keeps digging into Arcadia, he's going to end up under a damn headstone. That's not a threat. That's a timeline. Daniel's throat went dry. Arcadia, he remembered that name from an old bust years ago. A nickname used for a narcotics syndicate that had been growing in the Carolinas. High level, high risk, and never quite brought to justice. He watched more clips, corrupt deals, footage of warehouse drops, maps. Whitaker was deeply embedded, and Bennett had clearly been close to exposing it. Daniel took a breath and leaned back. It wasn't just about saving Bennett anymore. This was about rooting out the rot that had infested their own department. Ranger let out a low whine. Then he stood and scratched lightly at the door, not the one to the hallway, but the smaller one that led to Bennett's private records room, a space few people ever entered. "What is it, boy?" Daniel muttered. He opened the door. The scent of old paper and cedar hit him immediately. Inside, amid cabinets and case files, sat a locked drawer with a brass handle. On the surface lay a single envelope with Daniel's name written in Bennett's elegant script. He opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note and a folded slip of paper. The note read, "Daniel, if you're reading this, I've already failed to stop them. Don't let my silence be the end. If I'm not at our scheduled meeting on the 10th, look in safe deposit box 314 at Blue Ridge Bank. You'll need Ranger with you. Daniel unfolded the smaller slip. It was a bank key, small, copper-colored, marked with the number 314. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. The layers of mystery grew heavier by the hour, and the betrayal was clear now. Whitaker hadn't just turned a blind eye. He had orchestrated a takedown of his own chief. A knock came at the door. It was Officer Melissa Quinn, a patrol officer in her early 30s, short and practical, with cropped dark blonde hair and a demeanor that balanced sarcasm and competence. She looked unusually tense. "Sir, you asked to be notified if Whitaker returned to HQ." Daniel stood instantly. "He's here." "No, sir. That's just it. No one's seen him. His home's empty. His cruiser was found abandoned in a parking lot behind the old church on Henderson Street." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Issue a bolo. Put his photo out statewide. He's no longer to be treated as an officer. He's a suspect." "Yes, sir." After she left, Daniel looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd sat silently, but with ears perked. Something about his posture reminded Daniel of that night 5 years ago, when they'd stormed a warehouse together and Ranger took down an armed dealer who'd cornered Daniel behind crates of methamphetamine. That bite had saved his life. That trust had never wavered. Now they were in it again. Daniel tucked the flash drive back into his pocket, picked up the bank key, and turned to Ranger. "Let's go see what your old partner was trying to show us." They left Bennett's office behind, but not his voice, not his scent, not his unfinished mission. The sterile hum of machines filled the dimly lit ICU room. Soft beeping marked each fragile heartbeat. Chief Thomas Bennett lay motionless beneath thin white sheets, his weathered face drained of color, a breathing tube taped at his mouth. 2 monitors tracked his vitals, flickering in soft blue and green tones like a lighthouse in fog. Outside the glass-paneled door, Daniel Morgan sat in a hardback chair, elbows resting on his knees, Ranger lying at his feet. The German shepherd's head rested between his paws, but his eyes remained wide, darting toward every shift of shadow in the corridor. The hospital smelled of bleach and plastic and the weight of untold stories. Daniel hadn't slept in over a day. His hair was tousled, eyes rimmed with red, but his mind was sharp. The discovery of the USB, the Arcadia files, Whitaker's betrayal, it all pointed to one name that haunted the coded pages of Bennett's old journal, Osprey. And now that Bennett had barely escaped death, Daniel knew they'd try again. He wasn't about to let that happen. He checked the Glock holstered beneath his coat as 2 night shift nurses passed. One of them, a petite woman in her late 40s named Cecilia, had been tending to Bennett all evening. Her curly dark brown hair was pulled tightly under a surgical cap, and the crow's feet at her eyes deepened when she smiled at Ranger. "He's been a good sentinel all night," she said softly, patting the dog's head. "Wish more patients had guardians like that." Daniel managed a tired smile. "He's more than a guardian. He's family." At 2:14 a.m., the corridor lights dimmed to overnight mode. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Ranger shifted but didn't growl, yet. In the muted stillness, a faint clink echoed from the end of the hallway. Ranger's ears shot up. Daniel sat forward. Another clink. Then a soft hiss, like rubber sliding against tile. The ICU door's motion sensor didn't trigger. That meant someone had bypassed it. Daniel stood, hand on his weapon. "Who's there?" he called, his voice low but firm. No answer. He flicked the lights to full brightness. At that moment, 2 shadows split from the hallway, entering fast and low. One tall, lean figure in black tactical gear, the other stockier, face partially obscured by a cap and scarf. Daniel recognized the shorter one. Parker Ramsey, an ex-detective who'd been suspended months ago over alleged links to narcotics evidence tampering. His round, bulldog face and darting eyes were unmistakable. The taller figure raised a silenced pistol and moved with practiced ease. Daniel drew his weapon just as Ranger barked and lunged. Chaos erupted. The taller man, Nathaniel, the same one from the funeral, fired at Ranger, narrowly missing. Ranger tackled him mid-chest, sending both crashing into a tray of surgical instruments. Parker charged toward the bed, syringe in hand, clearly aiming for Bennett's foreline. Daniel fired once, grazing Parker's arm. The syringe clattered to the ground. Nathaniel threw Ranger off violently, and the dog yelped, hitting the edge of a metal cart. Blood stained his side, and he struggled to get up. Daniel's rage flared. He tackled Nathaniel from behind, slamming him against the wall. The man struck back hard, elbowing Daniel across the temple. As Daniel staggered, Ranger, though limping and bleeding, growled and lunged again, this time sinking his teeth into the man's coat. In the struggle, something fell from the man's jacket pocket. A slim, black syringe rolled beneath the bed. Suddenly, more footsteps echoed. Backup had arrived. A tall, muscular man in his late 30s entered first, sweeping his weapon across the room. His badge caught the light, FBI. Special Agent Reese Carson. Dressed in a dark suit, with close-cropped sandy hair and a no-nonsense glare, he moved with commanding authority. "Drop your weapon now," Carson barked. "Hands where I can see them." The taller man hesitated, glancing at the fallen syringe. Then he raised his hands slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said coolly. "I'm here on hospital security detail." Carson didn't blink. "We've had you under surveillance for 2 weeks, Nathaniel. That detail story won't fly." 2 more FBI agents swept in, cuffing both intruders. Parker was cursing under his breath, his eyes wide with panic. Daniel knelt beside Ranger, who now lay trembling but conscious. Blood soaked through the tan fur along his ribs. "He needs a vet. Now." Carson radioed ahead for animal emergency transport, then knelt beside Daniel. "You were right to post here. We've been chasing shadows, but this time, we caught something." As the agents bagged the syringe and began questioning Parker, Daniel picked it up using a pen. It was filled with a translucent amber fluid, similar to what Hannah had theorized might have been used on Bennett. Carson nodded grimly. "That'll help us charge him. But Osprey's still out there." Daniel exhaled. "We need to find that bank deposit box." Morning light filtered weakly through the hospital blinds as Daniel stood beside Ranger's recovery crate, fingers pressed gently to the dog's bandaged shoulder. Ranger lay still but awake, his deep brown eyes locking with Daniel's, breathing shallow yet steady. The sterile scent of antiseptics lingered in the air, but the sharp smell of gun oil still clung faintly to Daniel's clothes from the night before. He hadn't gone home. Not when the truth was unraveling at last. Ranger's fur had been carefully trimmed where the bullet grazed him, just above his ribs. A round had missed his lung by less than an inch. The vet, Dr. Marcus Dwyer, a lanky man in his 60s with thin glasses and the gruff demeanor of someone who had seen too many lost causes, had declared the dog lucky, stubborn, and tough as nails. Ranger had flinched when he was stitched but never whimpered. "He's a survivor," Marcus said. "That kind doesn't go down easy." Meanwhile, upstairs in the FBI's temporary field office, set up in Asheville General's Administration Wing, Special Agent Carson was laying out maps, documents, and photo arrays across a long wooden table. The conference room had been commandeered, whiteboards scribbled with names, locations, and arrows like a spider web of corruption that seemed to pull from every direction. Carson looked more focused than ever, his shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loose, eyes rimmed with sleepless determination. He wasn't just chasing suspects now. He was digging into a rotted system from the inside out. Daniel entered with a cup of coffee, which he handed silently to Carson. "Any word from the bureau lab on the syringe?" he asked. Carson took the cup, nodding. "Confirmed. That was a mix of lorazepam and atorphine. One to suppress, one to paralyze. It would have faked death in under 5 minutes. Same compound in the USB file from Bennett's jacket. Whoever's been orchestrating this knows chemistry and access." Daniel stared at the corkboard. "An Osprey?" Carson picked up a photo, a blurry security still of the man calling himself Nathaniel Cross, now in federal custody. "He's not Osprey, just a foot soldier. Senior, yes, but not the head. His real name is Leon Bracer. Retired Delta Force. Went rogue 10 years ago. Nobody's heard of him since until now." Daniel let that settle. So who is Osprey? Carson pointed to a name highlighted in red, Raymond Doyle. The name sent ice down Daniel's spine. Doyle, Judge Doyle, had been on the Asheville bench for over 25 years. A tall, clean-cut man with steel-gray hair and a sharp tongue, he'd presided over some of the city's most important cases. Publicly righteous, privately feared. Daniel had always sensed something off about him. Now it all made sense. Carson continued. Bennett was deep undercover. For the last 2 years, he's been collecting intel on a drug trafficking ring using the city's infrastructure, courts, zoning permits, even mayoral funding, to launder money. The mayor, Eileen Caldwell, is implicated. Documents show she signed off on construction contracts for shell companies. Daniel's jaw clenched. Caldwell, so pristine in public, so motherly in demeanor. So the whole city was rigged. Not the whole city, Carson said. But the top layer, yes. And when Bennett got too close, they moved to silence him. We intercepted encrypted messages from a burner phone signed, "O." Orders included. If Bennett is compromised, remove all handlers and neutralize close associates. Daniel turned slowly. Meaning me? Carson nodded. There's a fabricated report sitting in the evidence locker of Precinct 6A. It claims you were on Bennett's payroll. There's also a doctored photo linking you to a known drug courier. They were ready to burn you the second Bennett flatlined. Daniel felt the ground tilt. All the loyalty, all the years. Bennett had been his compass, and that compass had painted a target on his back. His fists clenched. What do we do now? Carson smiled grimly. We hunt the head of the serpent, but we do it smart and quiet. Back at the veterinary wing, Laura Bennett sat beside Ranger's crate. She looked paler than usual, her blonde hair tied back, dressed in a simple navy sweater. Her eyes, blue-gray like storm clouds, were red-rimmed but dry. She had endured too much grief to waste more tears now. I've seen Thomas fight through worse, she whispered, petting Ranger's paw. But I've never seen him this afraid. Not until the last few months. He stopped sleeping. He checked the windows every night. He told me once, if something happens, follow Ranger. He'll know what to do. Her voice cracked. And he did, didn't he? Ranger shifted slightly, his tail thumping once. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. He trusted the right people. Later that evening, Daniel returned to the hospital ICU. Bennett had not yet regained consciousness, but his vitals had stabilized. Daniel sat beside him in the quiet and opened a manila folder Carson had left him. Inside were records, emails, coded messages, bank transfers, all tying back to a numbered bank deposit box, Box 314. The one Bennett had mentioned in his pre-scheduled message. But the key? Still missing. As Daniel stared at the photo of the box, Ranger, now resting in the corner with a soft Elizabethan collar, suddenly stood up, wobbling. He sniffed the air, then limped toward Bennett's nightstand. He pawed once at the bottom drawer. Daniel opened it. Taped beneath a false bottom was a brass key, stamped with 314. The clouds over Asheville had thickened into a low-hanging quilt of gray, casting the city in a somber hue. Cold rain slid down Daniel Morgan's windshield as he parked across the street from Ashton State Bank. The brass key marked 314 sat in his jacket pocket, heavy and ominous. Ranger was in the back seat, bandaged but alert, his ears twitching at every sound beyond the glass. Despite his injuries, the dog had insisted on coming, sitting upright with a low, steady growl the moment Daniel reached for the key earlier that morning. It was as if Ranger knew that what lay behind this errand would change everything. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was sterile, brightly lit, and oddly impersonal. A receptionist with a too-tight smile and stiff blonde bun directed Daniel to the vault level. She wore a lavender suit and name tag that read Kayla, but her voice was mechanical, well-trained courtesy without true warmth. Daniel made mental note of her pale fingers nervously fidgeting with a pen. She was new, or perhaps just uneasy. The vault attendant, Mr. Henley, was a barrel-chested man in his early 60s with liver spots on his scalp and a voice like gravel. Box 314, he muttered, scanning Daniel's ID. Haven't had a visitor for that one in years. He led Daniel through two thick steel doors and into the safety deposit room, a long corridor of numbered drawers. The air here was colder, metallic. Daniel inserted the key and held his breath. Inside the box was a black leather folder, a microcassette tape, and a flash drive wrapped in a rubber band. No gold, no money, no confessions scrawled in blood, just cold, compact evidence. Ranger watched intently from just outside the vault, tail still, eyes locked on Daniel. Daniel returned to his SUV, heart racing. Rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof as he plugged the USB into his laptop. As the screen blinked to life, the first folder opened itself. Contingency Protocol Phase 3. There were audio files, photographs, financial logs, and several signed authorization letters. Daniel clicked on a folder labeled Vox_calls. The first recording started automatically. This is Commissioner Hart. Proceed with the Bennett extraction as discussed. Ensure he does not survive transport. If Morgan asks questions, initiate fallback framing. He's expendable. Daniel's stomach turned. Douglas Hart, the man who had built his career on anti-corruption speeches, who led the press conferences flanked by flags and grieving families. The same man who had publicly endorsed Thomas Bennett as chief of police, calling him a model of integrity in law enforcement. Daniel had once believed in him. Hell, he'd even shaken the man's hand at a fundraiser. Now he knew it had all been for show. Hart hadn't been shielding the city from corruption. He had been its architect, and Bennett had been promoted only to help manage public perception. A pawn dressed in honor. The next file was a PDF. Transfer logs for accounts in the Caymans, Singapore, and even domestic real estate transactions. Properties purchased under dummy LLCs that looped back to Hart through 4 layers of offshore laundering. Every transaction had a timestamp, a digital signature, and several included video stills from bank surveillance. One showed Hart in person, handing a black envelope to Judge Raymond Doyle. The timestamp was just 4 days before Bennett's death. Daniel slumped back in the seat. The web was bigger than he'd imagined. This wasn't just a dirty judge or a rogue mayor. This was a carefully built criminal architecture, supported by law and order's highest representatives. And it wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a death sentence on him. Ranger gave a low growl. Daniel looked up and saw the shadow of a man across the street, standing in the rain with an umbrella, unmoving. His silhouette was too still, too patient. Then he stepped away, disappearing into a black sedan that peeled off seconds later. Hart knew. Back at his apartment, Daniel downloaded a backup of the contents into a hidden drive and encrypted it with 2 layers of passphrase. He then called Agent Carson. "We have it," Daniel said. "It's Hart. Everything points to him. Voice recordings, financials, even images." On the other end, Carson paused. "We suspected, but we couldn't move without definitive proof. Stay there. I'll send a team." Daniel was about to respond when Ranger barked sharply, then bolted to the door. A split second later, the window near the kitchen exploded inwards with a sharp crack, gunfire. Daniel dove to the ground, dragging Ranger with him. They were being hunted now. Daniel grabbed his sidearm and led Ranger down the fire escape, through the alley behind the building, heart pounding. Rain soaked them instantly. The wind had picked up, swirling trash through the street. Daniel's boots splashed through puddles as he ducked behind a dumpster, listening. Another crack, this time near the roof. Whoever it was had a sniper's position. A professional. Ranger pressed against his leg, shivering but still growling. The dog's instincts hadn't failed them yet. They made it to Carson's safe house 20 minutes later. Carson opened the door with a Glock in hand, eyes wide. "They made their move faster than I expected," he said, ushering them in. Daniel dropped the wet folder on the table. "It's all there." Carson scanned through the files, his face tightening as he saw the weight of it all. Meanwhile, in a quiet office high above Asheville's city center, Commissioner Douglas Hart stood with his back to the window. The rain traced rivulets down the glass. He stared at a wall-mounted photo of him shaking hands with Bennett. His assistant entered. "They have the box," she said softly. Hart didn't turn. "Then it's time to clean the board." The rain returned to Asheville that evening, not in sheets, but in a soft mist that clung to the skin like a whisper. The city wore a veil of fog, dim streetlights turning the drizzle into halos of flickering gold. Daniel Morgan stood inside his modest cabin, hands clenched tightly around a burner phone, listening to the recorded voice message they had just crafted. It was Bennett's voice, taken from old voicemail fragments, spliced together by the FBI's tech specialist, and laced with enough subtle bait to stir a serpent from its lair. If something happens to me, the Cayman files are scheduled for release. That includes account 294B. He won't recover from that. It was short, clean, and aimed directly at Douglas Hart. Across the room, Agent Carson adjusted the small camera, hidden behind a stack of books on the mantel. Carson, now out of his usual blazer and in field gear, looked sharper than usual, lean in his 50s, his salt and pepper beard freshly trimmed, eyes constantly darting as if expecting shadows to move. "Once we send this," he said quietly, "we don't leave the house. Not even to piss. You understand, Morgan?" Daniel gave a curt nod. He had swapped his usual button-down for a black long-sleeved thermal. He looked more like the soldier he once was than the detective he'd become. There was no room for hesitation. This was no longer a case. It was survival. Ranger lay on the floor nearby, alert despite the lingering stiffness from his injuries. The German Shepherd had lost weight since the attack at the ICU. His right flank still showed a faint scar beneath the regrown fur. But his eyes? They were blazing, watchful, as though he, too, understood what was about to unfold. An hour after the message was sent, the first sign came, not from the phone, but from Ranger. His ears perked. He stood, tail stiff, then crept to the front door, growling softly. Daniel moved quickly, clicking the safety off his sidearm, while Carson whispered something into the earpiece. "They're on the move," Carson said. "2 men. Backyard perimeter. Thermal shows suppressed weapons." "Copy," Daniel replied, positioning himself beside the door. Seconds later, a soft rustle, a crack underfoot, then silence. Ranger bristled. The back door rattled slightly, like a breath being held. The first man came through the kitchen entrance, quiet as a shadow. He wore tactical black, gloves, goggles, suppressed sidearm already raised. He didn't see Carson until the butt of a rifle smashed against his jaw, sending him crashing into the pantry. The second intruder turned toward the sound but caught Daniel's boot square in the chest, falling flat onto the hardwood floor. Ranger launched, pinning the second man down, jaws snapping inches from his neck. The man didn't struggle. He froze, terror-stricken beneath the canine's growl. Then, "FBI, hands where I can see him." The operation was over in less than a minute. By dawn, a convoy of black SUVs lined the long gravel drive leading up to Douglas Hart's private estate, secluded behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. The mansion, once a symbol of his supposed success, now looked like a fortress about to fall. The FBI moved in fast, entry team breaching the front with no resistance. Hart was found in his upstairs study, still in his bathrobe, sipping coffee as if expecting no consequences. His calm cracked the moment he saw Daniel walk in with Carson. "You people, do you even know who I am?" Carson smirked. "Yeah, you're the guy who just sent assassins to kill a cop and his dog." Hart's eyes flickered. His lips parted to speak, but stopped when he saw Ranger enter behind Daniel, head high, stare locked. Even he couldn't hide the flinch. "You brought that animal?" Daniel leaned in. "That animal saved more lives than you ever pretended to. And you tried to kill him for it." Within the hour, Hart was in cuffs, driven away under heavy escort. But the real shock came when agents began processing evidence from his mansion. Hidden in a false wall in his wine cellar, they uncovered what Agent Carson would later describe as the Black Book, a sealed, encrypted tablet containing a kill list. Names, photos, locations. Underneath each name, a priority rating. Daniel Morgan Tier 1. James Bennett Tier 1. Ranger Tier 1. The last name stunned the entire room. Back at HQ, Daniel stared at the screen. "He put a hit on a dog," he muttered. "This isn't just paranoia." He knew Ranger saw things. acted on instinct. That terrified him. Agent Quinn, now overseeing the legal proceedings, stepped into the room. Her jacket was damp from the rain, but her gaze was resolute. "We've got him. And the list, it's going public." She glanced at Ranger. "Your dog just made national security history." Later that evening, Daniel sat alone in his living room, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Ranger rested beside him, head on his lap. Outside, the rain had stopped. A moonlight ribbon streaked across the hardwood floor. Daniel whispered, "We're still here. Still standing." Ranger gave a soft huff, tail thudding once. The air in Asheville that morning was crisp and clean, the kind that came only after a long storm had passed. Sunlight cut through the thinning clouds like a promise, illuminating the dew-laced grass of Riverside Memorial Park. The city breathed easier, lighter somehow, as if the weight of months, perhaps years, of concealed rut had finally been exhaled. And for Daniel Morgan, it was the first time in what felt like ages that he stood still long enough to feel the warmth of the day. James Bennett sat beside him in a wheelchair, his face pale but determined. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket across his lap. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, and his once commanding voice had thinned into a gravelly whisper, but the fire in those eyes, blue, sharp, unwavering, was undiminished. Ranger sat between them, bandaged but alert, his ears twitching with every passing breeze. The German shepherd's fur had grown in over the scars, and though his gait still favored one side, his spirit had not dimmed in the slightest. He was 7 now, his muzzle touched with gray, but every inch of him exuded the presence of a soldier who had earned his peace. Laura Bennett stood nearby, wrapped in a navy blue coat, tall and graceful, her brunette hair tied back loosely, strands fluttering in the morning wind. She had been the quiet force holding the past few weeks together, never once breaking in the face of chaos. Her warmth came not from outward cheer, but from a strength forged in grief and hardened in loyalty. Today her eyes were softer, but when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that belied her usual composure. "Before he woke up," she said quietly, watching the lake shimmer in the distance, he mumbled something. Just one sentence. Over and over. Daniel turned to her. "What did he say?" She looked at Ranger and gave a tearful smile. "He said, Ranger called me back." Bennett exhaled with a chuckle, eyes glinting. "And that dog always had a mouth on him." Daniel smiled, but his thoughts drifted. The city had changed since Hart's arrest. Arrests had been made. Names released. Judge Doyle had resigned in disgrace. Mayor Caldwell's office was under federal oversight. But perhaps the biggest shift was the one no one saw coming, when Bennett formally announced his retirement from the Asheville Police Department. "I've done what I could," Bennett had told the press. "But the city doesn't need a relic from the past steering it forward. It needs someone who still believes there's more to build. Someone who's been broken and put back together by truth." And then he named Daniel. The public reception was polarizing. Some called Daniel too young, too raw. Others hailed him as the only honest man who had walked through hell and returned with proof of the fire. But for Daniel, it was never about the spotlight. It was about rebuilding the broken from the inside out, with clear rules, real integrity, and unflinching accountability. Today, however, wasn't about politics. It was about Ranger. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of the honor guard's drums echoed across the park. Officers lined the perimeter of the flagstone path, uniforms pressed, hats in hand. Cameras flashed. But Ranger seemed unaware of the spectacle as he sat, tail flicking, eyes focused solely on Bennett. From the podium, Chief Deputy Rachel Whitmore, a middle-aged woman with streaks of silver in her cropped hair and a commanding presence honed from years in narcotics and internal affairs, stepped forward. She had taken on the role of acting chief after Bennett's fall and was now Daniel's strongest ally in the internal reform task force. Her voice, firm yet warm, carried over the crowd. "We stand here not just to honor bravery," she began, "but to honor loyalty that transcends species. To remind ourselves that sometimes the one who guards us most fiercely is the one who cannot speak." She gestured toward Ranger, who sat upright now, eyes steady, ears pointed. for his unmatched service, for saving lives, uncovering truths, and protecting our city even when it cost him dearly. We award K9 Ranger with the Medal of Distinguished Valor. A young officer approached with a velvet box and knelt beside Ranger. Inside lay a gleaming medallion, inscribed with the seal of the city and the word, devotion. As the ribbon was gently placed around his neck, Ranger made no sound. But he turned and leaned his head against Daniel's knee, accepting not glory but closeness. The crowd stood. Applause rang out, not the frenzied kind, but slow, rising, and reverent. Hours later, when the crowds had cleared and the speeches had faded into the earth, Daniel wheeled Bennett to a familiar bench under the elm trees that curved above the memorial path. Ranger lay stretched out between them, his breathing calm, his eyes scanning but finally at peace. Bennett broke the silence. "You know, when I found you years ago, drunk, arrested, throwing punches at shadows, I didn't take you in to fix you. I took you in because I saw you'd already decided not to let it break you." Daniel looked down, jaw tense, but grateful. "You saved me from becoming my worst version." "You saved me back," Bennett replied. "You and that damn dog." They sat in companionable silence, the wind rustling leaves in a hush like whispered absolution. Laura approached a moment later with 2 paper cups of coffee. She sat beside Bennett, her hand slipping into his. Daniel took a long breath, his voice quiet. "We'll rebuild it, you know. The department. Piece by piece." "I know," Bennett nodded. "And I'm proud I won't have to do it myself." Ranger yawned and rested his head on Daniel's boot, sighing as if to say, "Finally, peace." And there, in the quiet gold of late morning, under the outstretched arms of an old elm tree, 3 figures sat on a bench. A man who had once lost everything, a man who gave everything, and a dog who reminded them both why it was worth fighting for again. This story reminds us that sometimes God's miracles don't come in thunder or lightning, but in the steady gaze of a loyal dog, in the courage of a broken man, or in the quiet heartbeat of someone who refuses to give up. Ranger wasn't just a K9. He was a vessel of truth, a guardian chosen not by rank, but by purpose. Through him, and through those who believed in what was right even when it hurt, the city was saved from corruption. The lesson for all of us is this: God often works through the humble, the overlooked, and the wounded. You may feel small, forgotten, or unqualified, but if your heart remains faithful, you may be the very answer to someone's prayer. Whether you're a detective searching for justice, a woman holding on to love, or simply someone trying to do what's right, God sees you, and He can use you in mighty ways. Life is full of shadows, but remember, when we trust God, even the smallest light can break the deepest darkness. If you believe God still works miracles in mysterious ways, type Amen in the comments to show your faith. Share this video with someone who needs hope today, because sometimes one story can change a life. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of courage, faith, and redemption. May God bless you, your family, and all who are waiting for a miracle.